We are all acquainted with the concept that Chazal taught us, dor dor v'dorshov, dor dor umanhigov, that every generation has those who preach and speak to them, and every generation has those that lead them. So that has always been understood in the Jewish world, and to a certain extent, because of that, therefore, there is a corollary that people who are the right people for generation one are not necessarily the right people for another generation. And Chazal give us that idea when they say, for instance, Yiftach bedoro kishmuel bedoro. Yiftach, who in this portrayal in Tanakh is not necessarily the most spiritual or prophetic person that we ever had, but in his generation he saved the Jewish people, and he is the equal, so to speak, of Shmuel Hanavi, who is Moshe Aaron B'choranov, who Shmuel B'korei Shmo. Shmuel is on that level, but in his generation we needed Yiftach, and in Shmuel's generation we needed Shmuel. And they're not interchangeable. It doesn't work that way. And because of that, therefore, we see that the Torah is very careful to delineate this. And that's our understanding, or beginning of an understanding, why the Torah mentions the names of all of the leaders of the Shvatim when it has the count. It could have just said, Kol Nosi Bohem. The Nosi of the Shevet, the head of the Shevet, is responsible for the count. What do we gain from knowing the names of these 12 people? And then we have it again when they're counted a second time later in Chumash Bamidbar. And there's a different 12 names. And then when it comes to the spies, to the Meraglim that Moshe sent, so then there's a third set of names of 12 people. So this provides us with an insight that the person who is the Nasi of Shevet Ruvain cannot be the Nasi of Shevet Shimon. It is delineated in such a way that they are not interchangeable. And the person that was the Nasi of Shevet Ruvain in the second year, when the Jewish people were in the desert, so that's the generation of the generation that left Mitzrayim, it cannot be the Nasi of the Shevet Ruvain in 39 years later of Shevet Ruvain, when the Jewish people are to enter the land of Israel. They need a different name, they need a different person. And that's a very important historic lesson that the Torah teaches us, that people are not interchangeable parts, and that success in one generation does not spell success in another generation, and therefore it's dor dor v'dorshov, dor dor umanhigov. Every generation has to have its dorshim and has to have its manhigim. So to a great extent, that's a very hard lesson for the Jewish people to learn, because we always are nostalgic about the past. And because we are nostalgic about the past, so then we say, then we had leaders. Or if only that leader would still be. And those great people, so the truth is they were great people, and they were great leaders, but they were encompassed in their generation and in their society. And they're not necessarily transferable to our society and to the changed conditions that exist. I once had a debate with someone, and he told me that so-and-so, this great rabbi, said this and this about a certain situation. And he wanted to know why I didn't subscribe to that opinion regarding my congregation and the community. So I told him, that great rabbi lived in 1840 in Lithuania. I don't know what he would say today. I know what he said in 1840 in Lithuania. That I know. That he wrote. So then that's what he has to be judged upon. But I don't know what he would say today. You're making assumptions. You're making assumptions that he would never change his mind. So to a certain extent in our time, people make assumptions. The Holocaust never would have changed anybody's mind. The creation of the state of Israel would never have changed anybody's mind. All of the things that have happened to us, how do you know? What gives you, so to speak, the strength to say that that would be the case? So you have a famous discussion in Halacha. Sometimes the great poskim in their Sefer of Halacha wrote that the Halacha was one way. For instance, Rabbi Yosef Karo in Shulchan Aruch, so he says this and this and this. But Rabbi Yosef Karo also wrote the Sefer of Sharlis and Chuvas, of rabbinic responsa. And in that Sefer, he wrote differently. Sometimes he wrote even in contradiction to what he said in the other Sefer. So which do we follow? So there are opinions. The basic opinion, the basic psak, should always be that we follow the Chuvas, the Sharlis and Chuvas, and not the Shulchan Aruch. Because the Shulchan Aruch is a book of theory. It's a law book. I think one of the great things in the system of teaching law today is that they teach it from actual cases. They don't teach it from the law itself, how the law is applied in actual cases. So you have the case where it's a theoretical thing, and then you had a practical question that was asked to that very same rabbi, and he seemed to have said differently. So which opinion should you follow? So again, the thrust of halacha is that we follow the chuvas, because of the fact that it's based upon the practicality of life, and the other is like a think tank. Now in our time, we don't like to think that way because, what does the Mishnah Berurah say? The Mishnah Berurah is a book of laws. It's a think tank. But what about what's written in the Chuvas? So there's a second dimension to this, and that is what was written first and what was written last. We always try to determine what was written later, because a person can, and perhaps often should, change one's opinion, restudy the matter. So if in the book of laws that the person wrote was written, let's say, when he was 50 years old, and the book of rabbinic responsa that he wrote when he was 70. So then we would follow the book of written responsa because of the fact that it was later. He thought it over. He had 20 years more experience in life. He was a greater scholar. And there's another dimension to this as well. Why knowing who the person is important, because it determines to a great extent how we view the opinion. I mentioned to you often there's a great sefer by Rabbi Yisrael Isserlin, who was the Rav in Vienna in the 14th century. And his sefer is one of the basic books of Ashkenazic Psak Halacha. It's called Trumas Hadeshen. It's quoted very, very extensively. It's really one of the basic books. And he called it Trumas Hadeshen. Adeshen in Gematria is 354. And which is equal to the number of days in the lunar year. And so what he did is he composed 354 questions in halacha, situations, and then he composed the 354 solutions to the situations that he created. And he said that if you study one of his essays every day of the year, by the end of the year, you'll be a big lamdan. And the Ashkenazim have relied upon the Trumas Hadeshen as one of the basic pillars of Ashkenazic Psak, like the Rosh, etc. So there's an interesting comment that the Shach, Shabsai Cohen, who lived in the 17th century, 400 years later, makes. And he says, I don't think that we can rely so much on the Trumas Hadeshen. Because he says, he not only made up the answers, he made up the questions. So he said the questions were never real. We're not talking to a human being here. It's all think tank. And he said, a posek only has siyata d'shmaya, he only has the help of heaven to have the correct intuition how to answer if we're talking about real people. If we're talking about theory, we're talking about a think tank, heaven doesn't care about that. They don't inject you, so to speak, with any special abilities. So he said, it's difficult for me to say that I'm going to rely on the Trumas Hadeshen when he not only made up the answers, he made up the questions as well. They're not real. So that's another attitude. So you have to know the name of the person, you have to know who's involved, what were the circumstances, in order to be able to arrive at correct decisions. So that is something that's it's been lost a little in our time, because we became a very book-oriented religion. What does it say in the book? And the book doesn't always reflect the reality of the situation or which way the Torah wanted us to go. And therefore, you'll find in the Gemara always quotes names. It doesn't just say the theory. Rava said this, Abaya said this, Rabbah, who cares who said it? Especially, we're talking about people that we don't know 1,500 years. But you have to know who said it. And you have to know what the situation is. And the Gemara almost always will bring a practical case that occurred in front of their eyes to support the decision that they made. And they won't just leave it like that. And therefore you have all sorts of concepts in the Gemara. You have something called halacha ve'ein morin kain. This is the halacha, there's no question. But if somebody comes to ask you, don't poskim this way. Wow, how do you reconcile that? The Gemara says that's the halacha, but ve'ein morin kain, we don't poskim, we don't tell the people to follow this. So again, that's a sophistication in halacha that's necessary in order to understand how halacha works and how the Jewish society works, so to speak. But otherwise, and you see how that changes. There's a famous halacha in the Shulchan Aruch that a person that's sightless and exists in a community that does not have an Erev, so the Shulchan Aruch says that if he has to go with a cane in order to feel his way, so the Shulchan Aruch says he can't carry the cane on Shabbos. That's what the Mechaber says. The Aruch HaShulchan, 400 years later, says, he says, no, he can carry the cane. He says, because it's impossible for a sightless person to go without a cane, and therefore it's an appendage to his body. And he said it's no worse than somebody needs a crutch or a cane in order to be able to walk or stand. So therefore it's permissible. What does he do with what the Rabbi Yosef Karo did in halacha? He doesn't say that he's wrong. He just says that the circumstances are such now that it's obvious that the sightless person cannot exist without the cane. So therefore this is what the halacha must be. So these are ideas and concepts which exist, and they're based on how the Torah presents itself. So when the Torah presents itself in this week's parsha with all of these names, so who cares? No, you got to know, because it's not the same name that appears later. And the name of the man that had Ruvain is not the name of the man that had Shimon. You have to understand all of that. And by understanding it, therefore, one has a healthier and more thoroughly understandable view of what Klal Yisrael is. Rabbi Chananya ben Akashi Omer Otz HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Zakos Yisrael V'Filcha Chir B'Lahem Mitzvah Sh'Nei